In the first video, we talked about the two hemispheres of the cerebrum and how a student can learn nearly any subject using either side of the brain, depending upon how they approach that subject. So for example, music, art, or even reading can be a right or left brain activity, depending upon a person's strengths or weaknesses. In this video, we'll talk about how kids learn through their senses, how the senses loosely correlate to different parts of the brain, and how an imbalance in the brain can lead to learning struggles.
Who is at risk? We all learn through our senses, and we have our 5 senses: seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling. But we learn primarily through our 3 main senses of seeing, hearing, and touching. And those loosely correspond with these areas that we've talked about. So we have the hearing, which we're gonna call that auditory. You have the visual, which we will seeing, visual, and then the motor, which we're gonna call kinesthetic, K. Along with kinesthetic, and I have no idea what part of the brain this is, we're also going to include tactile, which means touching. Okay, so kinesthetic, which that word some people might not be familiar with, and tactile. So kinesthetic means moving, and tactile means touching. But we're going to lump those together as far as how learning happens, because kids who are kinesthetic, also who are very active, learn through movement, often also learn well through touching, the tactile sense. So we all learn through these main senses. The child who is maybe more kinesthetic might be very athletic. The child who tends to be more auditory might be someone who is a good speaker. Someone who is visual might be the artist. So, but how do they learn? So the motor, the active child, might learn best by doing. The auditory child might learn best by lectures, and the visual child might learn best by seeing. But we don't only use one sense. We use all of our senses, but especially the 3 of them in tandem, all working together. Now what we want to see is for these senses to fall in the normal range. I'm going to call this, what's within these 2 lines, the normal range. And so this is normal. And what we want is we want each one of the senses, auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, to fall in that normal range. So if you have a child who is very good at athletics, they might be high in the kinesthetic. Maybe their other senses will be in the within the normal range also, but they might be lower. The child who is very artistic might have the strong visual. They might also be kinesthetic, but not so much so, and maybe their auditory is a little on the weak side, but all within the normal range. So the goal is always to have the students' sensory input skills be all within that normal range. So when do we get into problems? We get into problems when one of these, or one or more of these, is out of the normal range. So for example, let's say that the kinesthetic is way kinesthetic and beyond normal, outside of the normal, too busy. And let's say that their auditory is really weak and their visual is somewhere in the middle here, okay? Their visual is in the normal range, but their kinesthetic is too strong and their auditory is too weak. So what you have is the child who, when you call to them, they don't hear you because their auditory sense is too weak, but they're busy moving all the time. because their kinesthetic is not tamed. It's outside of the normal range, and so it's too strong. So obviously, what kind of picture do you get in a classroom, in a resource room, in your family? What kind of picture do you get? You get the child who's labeled attention deficit hyperactive type, because they're too busy. And they might not be, their auditory might not be weak. Their auditory could be here in the normal range, but if it is often that it is weak, and then you've got a double whammy, because you have an auditory weakness and you also have that hyperactivity. So you might also see a child, though, who is maybe they're too strong in their auditory, and let's say that their visual is really weak and their kinesthetic is normal. This child might be the child who's always covering their ears. They can hear too much, and so they're like, oh, their auditory is overactive. So they might also have some sort of an auditory diagnosis there. Usually when you get the auditory below the normal range, then you're going to get into like an auditory processing weakness, or an auditory discrimination problem, those kind of labels. So here you might get in more of an auditory overload. Interestingly, if the tactile instead of the kinesthetic is too active, then you might see that sensory overload. So if your sensory is too high and too active, then your sensory overload, sensory processing disorder. But if you're sensory seeking, then your tactile, your kinesthetic tactile, but in particular the tactile, might be below normal limits, and so you're always craving to touch others, because the normal amount of touch, it just isn't enough for you. And then if you have, and this one is one where we see quite often, and it's kind of hard to explain, but if you have the visual too strong, if that visual spatial component is too strong and it's not toned down, that's the child you see that's kind of daydreaming. They're living in this spacey world. They're imagining things in their mind, and that's going to be their visuals too active. And then you couple that with maybe an auditory weakness, and you've got a recipe for dyslexia, a classic dyslexic. I know there's lots of different types of dyslexia, but the one we think about typically where kids are reversing their letters and that type of thing, they often have an auditory discrimination or processing weakness to go along with that. And when you see that kind of a picture, you're often going to see that classic dyslexic picture. So we might look at this, and so this might be one student here, and we call that child the KVA. Kinesthetic being their strongest modality, auditory their weakest modality, and their visual within the normal range. This would, like I said, might be the child who would be labeled with an ADHD. And again, I know that these labels are kind of floating as specialists change their minds about what we're going to call different things. But your classic attention deficit hyperactive kid is going to fall into that kinesthetic visual auditory, this picture. This picture here, like I said, that one is not going to give you as many disabilities, but they might struggle with noise and things like that. And so that would be the AKV. This child here, which is a VKA, we find lots of kids with disabilities in that arena, and that would be your dyslexic or possibly your ADD, and many times those not the hyperactive, but just the spacey student that often goes along with your dyslexia there. Now, there are 6 different types of these students, right? I mean, there's the KVA, the AKV, the VKA, there's also the KAV, the VAK, and the AVK. So we have these 6 different types. So you could look at, what you could kind of label kids as a kinesthetic learner with a weak visual learner with a weak kinesthetic. Now, you often hear about, learning modalities, learning styles. That would go along with this kind of a concept, except that this takes it a step further. So when you hear someone say, well, I've got a visual learner, well, the visual learner could be this student here, or it could be this student here, right? This student here, who's a visual learner, is very much at risk if they have their auditory below normal. So if they're at the visual's too high, the auditory is too low, then this child is greatly at risk for learning disabilities. This child, not so much so. Their visual might be too strong, and their auditory might be in the normal range, and the kinesthetic might be weak, but we often don't see that as a learning disability, because if they have weak motor skills, that doesn't really affect their schoolwork much, maybe some dysgraphia, that kind of thing where they're not able to write well, but that's not going to affect them a lot when it comes to learning to read and things like that. So where we see learning disabilities, in my opinion, is when we see an imbalance, when one modality is really, really strong and another one is really, really weak, and we get that off balance. And sometimes you'll even see that in like the gifted disabled concept. In that situation, when you have gifted disabled, you have something that's let's say it's very high, the visual is very high, let's say the kinesthetic is fine, but the disabled part comes where it's low, okay? So you have a disability when something is too low. If it's high in the normal range, you get a giftedness. So let's say you've got a person who's very athletic. They're going to be high in the motor, kinesthetic. Maybe they're pretty normal in their auditory visual. You're not going to have a disability. You're going to have an ability. You're going to have a giftedness when they're up high. So the goal for all students is to try to strengthen those weak modalities, and then tone down the ones that are overactive, and try to get all of your modalities in the normal range. Now, the higher they are in the normal range, the more gifted overall the child's going to be. Think of that concept then going back to my child's learning style. My child's an auditory learner, my child's a visual learner, my child's a kinesthetic learner. The next sentence is, teach to your child's strength. But what happens if we do that? So we teach to our child's motor strength. We let them do hands-on projects, that's fine. But if you have a child whose strength is there, and let's say they are low and disabled in the auditory, and you don't bring that auditory up, you're going to feed into a potential disability. So it's fine to teach to the child's strength, kinesthetic strength, visual strength, whatever it is. It's fine to teach that, but don't ignore that weak modality, or you're just going to encourage a disability if it's there latent. I like the concept of, which I'll talk about in another video, that Ron Davis in his book called The Gift of Dyslexia, he calls them potential dyslexics. So you have like I said, that this is the child who's typically dyslexic. You've got the kid who's like this, and you teach to their visual and to their kinesthetic, and you ignore the auditory, you're just looking for trouble. especially if you allow the daydreamy visual component, that spaciness, if you don't help get that in check, help the child get that in check. You've got to bring this down, this up, and bring those both in, all those into the normal range, and then we no longer have a potential dyslexic. But if we let it go, we let them flower and bloom at their own pace and their own way, you're just letting it happen. So that's why I really want to help parents and teachers, specialists understand that it's an imbalance or an out of normal range that causes disability. The potential is there, depending upon the child's strengths and weaknesses. The potential is there, but what we do about it is what determines whether or not the child has a disability or not. So my motto is, go ahead, teach to the strength. Let's strengthen the weakness. So thanks. If you like what I'm doing, hit the thumbs up. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.